Welcome to Mentoring Moments. Mentoring Moments is a sub-series of the E-Commerce Edge podcast. It is composed of clips taken from Jason's one-to-one and group mentorship sessions. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the E-Commerce Edge podcast with me, Jason Greenwood, your host. And before I introduce our amazing next guest to chat all things growth, I'd love to recommend wherever you're listening to this from, if you could do me one quick favor, and that is to share this with one other person. If all of our listeners share with at least one other person, then we can double our listenership overnight. You're our marketing team, so we always appreciate you sharing with somebody you think will enjoy and get value out of our content. We've got over 535 episodes of the podcast now to share, so we've got a deep back catalog covering many subjects. But without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Zac Fromson. He's the co-founder of Lilo Social. Welcome, Zac.
Thanks for having me. Super excited to be here.
I'm super excited to have you along for the ride with me today. And we were saying off air, I asked you how to pronounce Lilo, and I thought it was originally perhaps pronounced Lilo, because in New Zealand, that term is usually used in reference to an inflatable mattress. And then you corrected me and you said, no, it's Lilo. Before we get into what Lilo is and does and how you do what you do, how did you come to be in this incredible space of e-commerce, digital marketing, growth hacking, etc.?
Yeah, I'd say for a bit, we were doing a little bit of everything, probably early days, 2016, 2017, and we're drifting and learning a little bit of e-com. Started to get very good at it. In 2018, we basically decided as an agency that we were going to just focus solely in on e-commerce marketing. We weren't going to take on any other types of service lines or business, and where we really adopted Shopify and Klaviyo as our tech stack to better support people across the paid search, social, creative, and retention funnel. So basically since 2018, we've just been all in on e-com. So we're quite a bit here now, obviously going on 6, 7, 8 years here of just being fully dedicated to that. So really just become experts here for our crowd.
Love it. And this is the first, at least as far as I could tell. Now, it's interesting because LinkedIn can be a pretty incomplete coverage of a CV, but it looks like this is pretty much all you've ever done. I can't see any internships, previous jobs, roles, businesses. Like, you've been all in, boots and all, into this digital marketing thing pretty much since the beginning of your career, right?
Yeah, pretty much since day one, just been all in here. I'd worked at an ad agency a little bit prior, a smaller spot here before that. And then I've worked at a CPG beverage brand for a little bit, doing some sales and some sales support. So a little bit of retail experience, a little bit of smaller agency experience, but yeah, for the most part, pretty much been all in here.
And you're obviously a digital native, so this comes very naturally to you. But what attracted you to what about digital marketing and sort of this growth aspect of digital marketing attracted you to the industry? What was it that was what was the trigger for the fascination of getting involved in this space?
Yeah, definitely had a lot of interest in digital. Wasn't sure what I wanted to do 10 plus years ago here. So I've tried a little bit of everything. And I think what really attracted me to e-commerce was that there was a really direct and, I guess, tangible KPI to what we do here, where if you're building websites, it doesn't look good, and then you find out 6 months later how it's converting, or if you're doing awareness campaigns, like, great, there's a lot of views, but outside of saying there's a lot of views, like, what business metric did it really help improve? So I think for us, being able to directly tie back what we're doing in e-commerce to direct sales and understanding like where that affects top line, bottom line, and actual growth from an incremental perspective, was really easy to value our work and understand, are we driving results or are we not driving results for who we're working with? And it's pretty clean cut and clear whether we're doing well or not, and if we're helping someone grow or not. So I think there's nothing ambiguous about what we did. It was very clear that like we either drive a performance for you or not. And I think that is kind of what stuck out to me, that it felt really great, obviously, when you can help someone grow. And there was never a question or discussion about how things were going. KPIs were clear and discussed ahead of time. We knew what our goals were, and then we're either hitting them or not. And there was really nothing up for question of how many views did your billboard get, or what was the lift of this TV commercial, or a one-off project on a website, and then you're done. Like, there's just gave us recurring work and the opportunity to see someone grow over months and years. So I think that's what led us here. why we fell in love with it.
Yeah, it makes sense. And you are a full funnel, right? So all the way from awareness, acquisition, like all the way from the creative side to paid media, et cetera. Then obviously conversion rate optimization, meaning, okay, cool, we've got the traffic to the website. Now, can we get them to convert? Can we make sure that they're getting all the information they need to actually make a purchase? And then as a follow on to that, what does retention marketing look like? So what does email marketing look like? You're a 2025 Klaviyo champion. So obviously fully immersed in the Klaviyo stack, marketing automation stack. So you are pretty much running that full funnel, full customer life cycle, both marketing and retention, acquisition funnels. And were you always doing that from day one? Was it always acquisition, conversion, retention? Was full funnel and full life cycle marketing always part of your services layer, or did you start out just basically running ads for people?
We started off as just a paid social shop. So started off as media buyers, added on creative, added on search, added on some landing page work, and then added on email. And then we slowly started to say, hey, as we look at each piece of what we were missing, it's like, all right, we're buying media, but we can't control the creative. We need more control over the creative so we can do what's going to work. And then it's all right, we're only on social, but we're missing people on search. We need to add search. And then it's all right, we're getting traffic to the site. Traffic's not converting. We need to improve conversion rate. Or, hey, now we're getting people to convert. We're getting people to buy. The leads that don't buy right away, or if it's a low AOV product and we need retention, we can't control repeat customer rate. So we need to add email. So I think as we just went further and further down, we'd understand like where we see pain points or like why a customer would churn from us. And we'd be like, all right, it's because the retention rate eventually just kept going down. Conversion rate wasn't good enough. Retention wasn't good enough. Creative wasn't good enough. So we started to realize we need to add each service to go further down the funnel so that we can say at any given day now when we work with a brand, I'd say most brands here are full funnel with us. So it allows us to say, hey, like this part is hurting. Let's deploy more resources to X, Y, and Z, do this service, or basically try to build out a better program for wherever we're struggling in the funnel so we can fill those gaps. And it's not just hoping that fixing better creative will improve where we're going to end or where we're going to go. I think that just helped us better fill the gaps to make sure that businesses can actually be successful.
And look, you've been doing this for nearly 9 years, full-time, focused deep into this space. We've had a lot of disruptions to our e-commerce world. I've been doing e-com for 25 years, so I've seen a lot of disruptions. I've seen a lot of patterns change over the years. When I first started out with my own e-commerce pure play many years ago, it was like turning on a tap with Google Ads, right? They called it Google AdWords at the time. It wasn't called Google Ads, and almost everything was 5 cents a click. It was cheap. It was plentiful. There was actually more eyeballs or more demand than there were advertisers. It was cheap. It was easy. And it was literally like flipping on a light switch and driving traffic to your website. And search was always so high intent that conversion rates from Google's ads were just ridiculously high converting. And unless you had a terrible product or you had a terrible price, or you just couldn't build trust when people landed on your website for whatever reason, other than those reasons, you really didn't have an excuse not to win in e-commerce in the early days. But man, the level of competition out there is wild today. CAC is sky high and rising for most brands, most categories, most verticals, most regions, most markets, combined with the fact that we had everybody and their dog try to start an online business during COVID, and then the collapsing TAM post-COVID meant that the cost structures for most of these weak businesses forced them out of business. And I said all that to say that starting an e-commerce business or starting a new brand today is probably easier than it's ever been before, but being successful with that brand, being competitive with that brand, being sustainable with that brand is probably more difficult than it's ever been before. And now AI enters the chat, right? And AI UGC enters the chat, AI ads enter the chat, AI creative enters the chat, and it feels most major brands are beset on all sides by growth challenges, and the costs in many cases are spiraling out of control so fast that unless they have a defensible moat via a really strong brand, and if they're an aggregator retailer, really curated range of products or really unique products, if they're a manufacturing brand, it feels like it is now it's harder than it has ever been for brands to find success online. Is that been you've been in this long enough to see the early days when it was a lot easier for brands to win online to where now it's a big ask for a brand to go from scratch to success without pouring a fair bit of coin into that process?
Yeah, definitely not. It's not scrappy and easy as it used to be. I think to your last point, they're like, if you're only showing up to the table with $10,000, you probably don't have enough. Like you probably need to show up to the table with hundreds of thousands of dollars and partners that bring different value. You probably need to have a couple of partners, someone who can really help with business operations, someone who can help with product development and actual production, and someone who can probably help on the advertising and marketing side and bring in strategic partners that have cash as well, to be quite frank, or investors that have cash and the right strategic founding team to be successful. It's super important. You can't just come to the table like really lean, really scrappy and make things work. Some brands can, but it just makes it even harder to be successful. I think the biggest thing is that compared to what you're saying, compared to years ago, I think that the biggest thing was like the saturation was way less. There wasn't as many brands popping up. So competition, cost to advertise, things of that nature were a lot cheaper and the noise was a lot less as ads were way less common. And now the meta as a whole, they're just plastered in advertising and in every placement possible. And it's heavy. On stories now, there can be back-to-back ads in between your friends' posts. There's a lot of noise, a lot happening. Economic factors do not help. I guess like the average family household's deployable catch for a lot of these things as well. And there's a lot of copycats and other things popping up for brands that do launch, that if you launch, you do have a good product, people are going to notice and you're going to have a lot of copycats in your space, which can help develop market awareness and market share, but also can make you fight for market share as well. So it really depends on what's happening. So product innovation is super important. Also trying to not necessarily create new markets is something that I see is very difficult. When over innovative products sometimes need too much education. So I think trying to like innovate spaces that make a lot of sense. And I think margins are everything to me. If you're not coming to the table with 70, 80, 90% room, you probably don't have enough room for shipping, advertising, production, everything, so on and so forth. So if your cost of goods sold is at you're at 50% before we're even talking about 3PL shipping and advertising costs, never mind your fixed outbacks, like you're in trouble. We're probably not going to really float here on D2C. So I think the other thing that I push a lot of our brands to try to improve is trying to either get their outbacks costs down where necessary or improve their product margins over time, whether that's getting bigger inventory buys, sourcing new materials, finding better places to produce their products. But you can't just rely on the ad anymore. You have to be improving that, but you also have to be trying to improve your business and your product development as well to be successful. So yeah, in theory, it's a lot more difficult to get in market and be successful in market. You need quite a bit more experience, strategy, and products that are set up to be successful within the space. And if you can't pass that initial test, you probably shouldn't go further and try to figure that out later if you're super far off on margin.
Yeah, and I think there's two other things I've witnessed, particularly over the last decade, that have become the norm in the market that is further pressuring new brands in particular, which is creator-led brands, whether that be stars, famous people, whether that be social influencers, whatever, starting brands from scratch. And they've already got almost like a ready-made market for them to go into where they've got the cost of distribution, sure, of the product, but they don't have the cost, they don't have the extreme cost of acquisition because they've already got a large fan base, a large audience base that's already coming to them for interesting content. And therefore, it feels like a natural bolt-on play, whether they're on Instagram, whether they're on TikTok, whatever it might be. It feels natural for them to come out with merch or unique products or unique designs, whatever it might be, or collabs with major brands, etc. And so it feels like they have a natural in the space at a relatively low cost of acquisition. And then we have direct to consumer brands that are Chinese brands. So for example, where they maybe historically, these brands have maybe been a white label manufacturer for other brands, but now they're actually creating brands of their own and they're going direct to consumer, direct from China. Obviously, tariffs have played a massive role in upsetting that apple cart and will continue to play a role in upsetting that apple cart. So how have you seen the rise of creator-led brands, star power-led brands, combined with direct-to-consumer brands, direct from China? How have you seen that pressure the local market in the US in particular when new brands try to start up? Like you said, it's pretty easy for a Chinese manufacturer to create a copycat brand and a copycat product at a cheaper price and go direct to consumer, ship direct from China. The de minimis thing is changing is probably going to put the kibosh on a little bit of that. But certainly we've seen those two pressures in particular over the last decade, I think, impact the market in ways it was difficult to predict.
Yeah. So I guess Starting with the first one, just the influencer-led brands. I think there's this guise that just because you have a following means you can successfully build a brand, and I think that's not the case. And I think too many influencers are just trying to start products and think that like they can just magically grow a business just because they have a following, and that's far from true. It certainly helps to have free advertising that you can move that to your audience and your followers, but we've worked with quite a few different brands, and honestly, like, without naming a few, like we've seen some A-list celebrities have brands that are absolute flops. There's some influencers that have 1 million followers we worked with that when they post here and there, they can move product, but when they shoot an email out to their followers, they can move some product, but it's not as consistent as it needs to be. And it's not a lot. Like maybe it can help them be small scale from a lifestyle perspective if they just roll out 1 or 2 products, don't go too crazy, do it right, and are really just looking for no operational cost, just get a 3PL, like very minimal customer service support, and really just be super lean to push from their followers. But the second they start pushing ads and trying to build a business, like no one cares who they are. Like people don't, not everyone knows who you are, even if you have 1 million followers. Like your followers are all that matter. Does it help that you can create free content for UGC and shoot photos and probably have other influencer friends that can help create content? All that stuff helps, but like, you still need a good business. You still need good margins. You're still going to run into the same pieces that everyone runs into. You only get so far with that. I think it's a leverage advantage, but you also need to like still bring the business team to the table. So I think that stuff is helpful. It's a helpful tool to have as part of the business, right? And I think like they should still bring partners in around them. It's like their values that they're an influencer, right? And they can bring that value, but they still need a marketing partner. They still need an op partner. They still need production. They still need all of these things done properly to be successful there. So I think again, they have a unique skill set what they can bring to the table. And I think building a good team around that is what's needed, and just trying to build this scrappy alone just doesn't really work to any like real scale.
And if you were to look across the brands that you work with, the ones that have been successful over the medium to long term, what would you say are the 1, 2, 3 things that is pretty consistent across all these businesses that you could pinpoint and say, look, these are the things that these guys have done. Maybe they've had to adapt, sure, but here's the core fundamentals. You mentioned a couple. If you don't have sort of 70% gross margins minimum going in, you're probably going to struggle. If you don't have a good business acumen, you're probably going to struggle. If you don't know your numbers, you're probably by definition going to struggle. If you can't do effective sourcing and then pivot sourcing when the market changes or when tariffs hit or when COVID hits or when you can't find alternate sources of logistics, when you can't find a really good freight broker, freight forwarder to work with, when you can't, I feel like there are some real core fundamentals here that would apply whether you're doing an online business, an offline business, doesn't really matter. There's certain core fundamentals to operating a business successfully. It's almost like it's a recipe, right? There's certain ingredients that have to be there as a bare minimum for a business to succeed. But are there any real key call outs here that you would say, look, the businesses that we work with, they have these 1, 2, 3 things in common that pretty much consistently they bring to the table that makes them a success and a sustainable success at that?
Yeah, I mean, you did obviously hit quite a few of them here for me. Some stuff I've been reiterating. So yeah, I think a lot of the things to echo are super important on that lay. I guess if I had to add on to that, I think creative production is super important. Outside of that, I think like some of the like the team, the intangibles, all those things you laid out, but I think like teams that are also doing really good work are brands that are also like open and willing to test. Some people are like too brand focused, and it is important as you go, but I think having a little bit of fluidity to try some new things, deep comfort zone, or do some stuff off brand at times to see how that works. I think are brands that also can find ways to be successful. And I think brands that just don't ignore the problems or don't try to blame the wrong things can be honest when conversion rate's too low, that like we need to invest in fixing what's happening on site. And maybe that's offer, maybe that's price point. And then, hey, like maybe we test a lower price point and it works so much better. And then the brand's, yeah, we can't fix our cost of goods sold. And it's like, well, you have to. So I think trying to be like honest with the problems is super important as well. Aside some of those key pieces that you hit on that we've already talked about.
And have you guys started to work at all with TikTok shops? They seem to be, obviously, there's a bit of a gray area around TikTok, whether it's going to be banned, whether it's not going to be banned, whatever the case may be. But if it doesn't get banned, it seems to be definitely a force to be reckoned with in the e-com space, particularly for influencer-led brands, founder-led brands, et cetera, that have a strong narrative, strong story, compelling story or entertaining. We're starting to even see some of the global, what we would consider boring brands, staid brands, more traditional brands that you would think would never be on TikTok. We see them, I guess, experimenting from a content perspective, from a playfulness perspective, from a risk perspective. It feels even Bose and some of these large, what we would consider almost stuffy brands, we see them willing to take more risks. At least that's the way I see it. That's the lens I see it through. We see them willing to take more chances on TikTok with their content to try to resonate with perhaps a younger audience. They're willing to push the boundaries a little bit more on TikTok versus even Instagram, and definitely versus other platforms like maybe a Reddit or a LinkedIn or whatever it might be. It feels that they're willing to take more chances there, and it feels like they're willing to push their brand story in new ways to resonate with newer, not necessarily younger, because TikTok's aging up. And so I wouldn't necessarily say exclusively a younger audience, but definitely new audiences that would be difficult to attract or difficult to resonate with any other way. Are you seeing something similar happening?
Yeah, TikTok's a tricky platform. I think it's the hot buzz and has been for a few years now. And I think there's so much conversation around it. And honestly, it reminds me of Snapchat about 10 years ago. So I think it's not for everyone and it's not always going to work and not always going to pan out. But everyone just like, I heard it's great. We have to be here. I'm like, we're a TikTok shop. We do quite a bit of work there. But I think too many people want to over index or overemphasize it. And not every brand is right for it or has the resources for it. Definitely creative production heavy. You definitely need to be having a lot of posting to build an organic audience. There's no doubt there. Influencer seeding is heavy. TikTok shops can be an absolute beast, but it's not easy. It has to be done right. And you need to have a lot of product deployment across a lot of influencers, not tens, but hundreds to get the critical mass you need to really get shops running and booming. And ads, I think, work really well for certain brands. And I think brands that are doing organic well, that are doing shops well, ads become important for that. And they agree to be on top. But if you don't have an organic following, you aren't seeding, you aren't running TikTok shops, just running ads to move e-commerce product on a actual click basis, probably won't pan out for you. It's not like the magic wand without doing the actual content creation at scale and volume that's needed to build that organic presence. And I think if you have an organic presence, doubling down on ads allows you to hit that mid-funnel audience, retarget your followers, and prospect a little bit harder because you already have some awareness on the platform and you've already built some critical mass on the platform. You have the content to support the ads. You can run Spark ads. You can really take advantage of the full platform. So I think if you're not doing the basics, jumping straight to ads because it's easier probably isn't the right thing to do. You probably need to be able to have the resources to build from the bottom up, and you need resources to do it. There's no doubt. It's not a light lift. You can't just whip together a couple of static ads and run with it. You need to have a serious outreach strategy, and it's not an easy task to be had. So I think a lot of brands are trying or want to try, but don't want to fully invest or don't have the knowledge of the team or the agency to take that on. And by no means is it light lift. So I think if you're really needing to build there, you need to go all in. And I think you do need to have a creative and fun product. If you're just selling something very basic, very simple, it's probably not going to take off. But I do think that the fun, creative products that kind of have some utility to them definitely do. Social built products definitely do a little bit well than a traditional product there. So I do think there's serious investment that has to be done to be successful. And everyone hears these success stories and thinks that they can quickly replicate that, but don't understand the commitment and the work that went into these viralities and of what, occurred there. Definitely something that's interesting. And I do and have heard some brands that have hundreds of thousands of followers or millions and we're going viral. It's again becoming a more crowded space. So a lot of brands are not going viral as they were. And it's a lot harder to be competitive than it was a couple of years ago while it was still emerging, right? The space is getting busy. So it's just getting harder and harder.
And let's talk channel mix for a moment. I don't know if you work primarily with retail aggregator brands or D2C brands that are manufacturing their own product and trying to build their own unique product market fit range. But there's been a lot said about Amazon and its growth over the last decade in particular, and the fact that it's now the number 3 paid marketing channel, paid and performance marketing channel in the world after Google and Meta. So it's not going away. Amazon's growth has been meteoric. They're having their own challenges with counterfeit products and direct Chinese sellers and unsafe products, and they've had a lot of scandals, for lack of a better term, around products, and they've faced their own challenges, but they've come through most of those reasonably unscathed, at least as far as I could tell. I'm not an Amazon ad guru by any stretch of the imagination, but it feels with 50% of every e-commerce dollar spent in the US going to Amazon today, it feels like a necessary evil for most brands to be visible on that channel, if for no other reason than to block competitors from taking that space entirely. And it feels like channel mix and channel selection, not only from a marketing perspective, but from a transactional perspective, it feels like selecting that and getting that right is more important than ever before. Are you seeing similar things emerging in the market?
Yeah, Amazon is I don't want to say the new, but it's a shopping search engine, right? People aren't just going to Google anymore to search for solutions. They're going to Amazon to search for product solutions, potentially first. So if you're not there and you're not visible for those solutions, it's certainly a problem. And there's a lot of people who don't want to shop on a million D2C sites, having to create accounts, get emails, wait for 1 to 2 weeks shipping. A lot of people only and will exclusively shop at retail or on Amazon, and very sporadically that they will leave those ecosystems. I think being on Amazon is super important. Even if you're just there for branded, it's still powerful, whether there's a lot of scale in a non-branded space and you're running advertising. That's a whole separate story, but there is a level of runoff where if you were just to load up your products and get set up, that if someone's looking for your iced tea and they're searching you by brand name, like, you're bound to show up. And if you're running Facebook ads, people will discover you on the site, decide they want to buy, open up their Amazon app and look for your brand name or your product or your flavor on Amazon, and then 1 click, 2 days ship to their house, right? Then they don't need to go through the whole paying for shipping and all the other things that might come under D2C site. If you don't have fast shipping, if you don't have free shipping, or at least a low enough free shipping threshold, you're asking a lot in checkout, things like that are complicating the process. You might have more runoff to Amazon, but I think looking at your business as a blended P&L digitally and trying to understand what's happening on Shopify and Amazon in aggregate, and potentially Walmart if you're there as well, is probably more important. And looking at your total MER against that rather than just splitting this out, looking at each shopping ecosystem as its own. They do work hand in hand. It's really difficult to track the runoff and where things are coming from, especially as you grow and scale, but the runoff is real. And potentially, if you can look at your business health as a whole, your total spend against your total sales across Shopify and Amazon, you can make better spend decisions rather than just worrying about a 7-day click ROAS in Meta or in another ad platform when it's probably underreported because of attribution, longer purchase windows, and runoff to other retailers or Amazon or Walmart. Yeah, I do think trying to be everywhere is super important, and trying to look at your P&L blended is super important, and potentially setting some different benchmarks there, knowing that's happening. It does allow some brands to scale a bit further rather than just trying to hold Meta accountable to Shopify only, knowing that's not the case.
And how do you feel about the channel mix when we start thinking about physical retail, strategic wholesale, et cetera? Because the reality is that in America today, depending on your vertical, your category, and your business, only about 20 to 30% of total retail spend is online. For all the talk about e-commerce taking over the world and everything else, in New Zealand, it's sub 15%. In Australia, it's around 20%. In America, it's around 25 to 30%, depending. In Asia, depending on the country, 30%, up to 50%. But the reality is that e-commerce is still in the minority of total retail spend, and there's no two ways about that. Sure, it's up and to the right. Sure, it's growing as a percentage of total retail, but that growth as a percentage is slowing, particularly at the end of COVID. So when we think about the channel mix, it's really difficult for a brand to be everywhere at all times without some strategic either retail locations of their own or some strategic retail partners or some distribution partners that can get into markets and in front of certain customer cohorts that you'll never, no matter how much money you spend on ads, no matter how much you spend on marketing, no matter how much you spend on billboards, it doesn't really matter. There are certain cohorts of customers you just will not be able to access without some strategic partnerships and some strategic channel initiatives that get you in front of customers that you can't access directly. And they have their own favorite They have their own favorite malls, they have their own favorite retailers, they have their own favorite channels that they like to buy through, and those might not be digital channels. Or if there are digital channels, they might not be your digital channels. And so the reality is that it feels like a omni-channel approach today is one of the ways. I wouldn't say it's the only way, but it's one of the ways in which you can create a more sustainable, resilient business if all CAC falls to you because you don't have any retail partnerships or you're not selling wholesale. If you're not looking at ways of de-risking your business, if all customer acquisition and retention costs fall to you, that's a heavy lift, especially for new brands. So it feels we've seen this failure to diversify channels and to get into strategic wholesale by brands like Allbirds, which it's likely they're going to go out of business this year because they were too late to the party. They staunchly resisted wholesale. They staunchly resisted distributorship up until about a year ago. And then they decided, as a Hail Mary last ditch attempt to save their business, they decided to take on a master distributor in Europe. They're taking on some wholesale distribution opportunities in the United States, but it's looking like it's likely to be a little bit too little too late here. And even vaunted Nike and many other household brands that staunchly resisted wholesale or shutting wholesale doors, shutting out retail partnerships, going back to more of a D2C play, they've realized, geez, this really hurts and it's really expensive. And it really, what it does is it ultimately limits our visibility in the market because we have to take on all that visibility responsibility ourselves. So I'd love your thoughts on omnichannel. I'd love your thoughts on strategic wholesale and the importance of being in front of as many consumers' eyeballs as possible, regardless of whether that's under your own brand or somebody else's brand.
Yeah. I think it's kind of back to the synthesis here of like why you need to be on Amazon and Walmart as well as Shopify. It's if you can be in retail, like why not as well? I think you're trying to just develop your business and grow. I think just develop your business and grow. Besides that, like maybe the first time someone sees or tries that, they can buy your face masks and CVS, and they're going to go buy them at CVS when they want them and need them, right? So I think there's opportunities here and there. I think the biggest thing is like you have to blend your P&L, you have to blend your business, you have to look at your total advertising spend against your total business, and then try to understand where your efficiencies are coming from. Do holdout tests, or just try to understand that we can spend 3%, 10%, 25% of our gross against the business and set some sort of goals, understand like what your costs can be, and then just push those boundaries and push those limits as far as you can to do what you think is best to get that growth. So yes, I think brands would be foolish not to take advantage of all opportunities to sell product everywhere. I think if you're going to white label, that maybe is a different conversation, but getting into retail, wholesale, Costco, wherever it's going to be, even Costco, even if it's break even just for exposure, it's incredible what virality can happen just for a small run in Costco and what that runoff can be as you end up in different places. Or some brands have done really well in airports. It just builds this idea that, hey, it's an extremely expensive shelf space in airports, but really, wow, you've made it your major brand if you're in airports. And then that runoff and that exposure and that experience helps you in retailer D2C. It helps you hit more wholesalers. People are like, wow, if you're in airports, why are you not in our wholesaler or retail opportunities? So yeah, I do think trying to build a holistic business makes sense. I think it's like, where are you scrappy? Where can you start? What do you need to do to get into some of the bigger big box pieces? You can't just hop into Target from day one. You have to build some demand. So I do think like it's a balancing act here, but I think to your point, like Allbirds just completely abandoning that and ignoring that and trying to just be purely D2C is different. And they just lost the coolness in market as well. People just don't think their products are attractive anymore. They just aren't into their products, into utility. They diversified in some weird ways with products that were not what people came to them for, but then they lost sight of what they were trying to do. So they obviously are trying to meet valuation as well. Some of these brands just raise too much and are way overvalued and are just doing crazy things to try to ever meet their valuation, which may or may not be possible, or it becomes extremely challenging to do. And I think that's why I think a lot of investment that's happening now, especially in D2C, is it's not a race to the bottom anymore. People are really looking for real revenue, real growth, real opportunities. It's not just let's bite it out for market share. And just growth at all costs is no longer the mantra. Profitable growth is now the mantra, where a few years ago it was just growth at all costs, and you just can't run that way anymore.
Yeah, I guess in a ZERP era, growth at all costs, when money's essentially free, then all of a sudden growth at all costs becomes the priority. But when money has a cost, all of a sudden profitability starts to matter, EBITDA starts to matter, success metrics, growth metrics start to really matter. But also, what does your retained margin look like over time? That starts to really become an important thing. And if an acquirer or an investor or whatever starts to look at your bottom line and it's your ASPs are falling, like your average selling prices are falling, but your margins are falling at a faster rate than even your ASPs, then we probably have a real issue here. But even if your percentage margin is staying the same, but your dollar margin is dropping because of competitive pressures, and so your ASPs are falling, your percentage margin will stay the same, but your dollar margin is dropping through the floor at the same rate as your ASP is falling. That's also not a very sustainable business. And I learned that the hard way in my first pure play online business. When we got into selling memory cards, for example, in the very, very earliest days of memory cards, when they were brand new to the world, we were selling 32 megabyte, not gigabyte, megabyte memory cards for $650. And so the margins were great from a percentage perspective, which meant that the dollar margins on $650 individual memory cards were great. And for the life cycle of our business, our percentage margin stayed roughly the same. But when that same $650 memory card drops $20, the dollar margin you're making ain't great. And so you've still got to look at not only your percentage margin, but you have to look at your dollar margin too. And is that sustainable as a business? Can you grow volumes? If the ASPs are falling in the market, can you grow volumes at a sufficient rate to replace that so that you can keep a constant revenue level or not? And so that's why when you're talking about operators, these are the types of questions, these are the types of scenarios, these are the types of things that really savvy, experienced operators, they're looking at all these facets and all these KPIs of their business. They're not just looking at, okay, what is my percentage margin? They're looking at the total market opportunity. They're looking at the growth opportunity. They're looking at the ability to control the selling price of their products in the market and not being undercut in the market and forced to drop their prices to be competitive in the market. And so I feel like there are so many sometimes these business rules or these business laws, sure, we can read them in a book, but until you experience them firsthand for yourself, it's hard to really understand the visceral impact that has on you until you're in the eye of the storm, so to speak. And so that's where I feel being a wartime general, if you were running a business through COVID, if you were running a business through the GFC, if you were running a business through the rise of Chinese brands, like if you were running a business over the last, say, 15 to 20 years, you've seen enough recessions, you've seen enough downturns, you've seen enough market disruptions that you have enough scar tissue to understand that whilst things might be great today, that there's no guarantee that's going to be great tomorrow. And you need to be planning in advance for any and all potential market disruptions. And you need to be building moats around your business as fast as humanly possible because the heyday doesn't usually last forever. Which would that be a sound piece of advice for these operators out there, especially young ones?
Yeah, I echo on that totally. It's just such a different landscape, such a different world. You got to really try to build something that can be able to bounce, right? You can't break on so easily with so much opportunity, right? For economic swings, you just don't know what's coming next. I think trying to really make sure that you can build those moats and really protect your business is more important than absolutely ever. It just isn't as easy, isn't as lean as it used to be. We have been in a pretty tough stretch for the past 5 years where we're not just like recovering from COVID. We're long past COVID. Like we've rebalanced back from that. We are living in like a slightly different world or a slightly new world based on what's coming, what's happening. What's happening now, like tariff wise, like no one could have predicted this was going to be a ripple effect, right? So it's like what's coming next, and there's always going to be a bump in the road. So trying to prepare yourself for some level of stability. Don't overextend yourself too far. Sometimes slower growth is okay, right? You don't need to always hit a grand slam and be moving about 1,000 miles an hour. Sometimes one step slower could be a little bit safer. So it's really just also down to what type of cash you have, what's your risk tolerance, and what are you really trying to accomplish? And especially if you're a new founder or an early founder and you aren't as experienced, right? Speed isn't necessarily your friend. Too fast could lead to a crash. But I think if you've done it once, you're trying to do it again, you kind of already have the playbook. It's a little easier, a little faster. You already have connections, network, provability, building that trust, getting that buy-in, just going to happen so much faster if you've already had a successful exit that you probably can move faster based on what you already know, the experience you have. You can run that playbook again.
And what are your thoughts on attribution? Because there have been tools out there that have come out from Northbeam to Triple Whale, etc. There are specific MTA tools out there, but then we also have tools which kind of can show a very different view on your business. And if you're running a really complex omni-channel business that's operating across 3, 4 digital channels, plus physical, plus wholesale distribution, strategic retail, all that sort of stuff. If you're running a really complex omni-channel business, MTA starts to really struggle to start to understand when you pull one lever on one side of the business, the ripple effect it might have across other sides of the business. So if you're a manufacturing brand, a D2C brand, and you're listed on locally, which means that your retail partners, effectively, it's almost like a store locator for all your retail partners as well. You could be driving demand that way and not necessarily even realize it or not necessarily be able to attribute it to that. I feel like plug some gaps that MTA just will never be able to reach, but then is a little bit. Let's talk about marketing mix modeling. Let's talk about multi-touch attribution. Let's talk about data and analytics. Let's talk about trying to get a clear picture of things that are actually genuinely moving the needle in the business as opposed to just feel-good metrics that make us feel good about our brands but aren't necessarily moving the needle in a positive direction. What type of analytics do you guys try to bring to the table on behalf of your clients that unmuddies the waters, shitifies things to where they have a really clear understanding? Okay, if I put $1 in over here, I'm likely to get $2, $3, $4, $5, $10 out over here. Or if I put $1 in on this other side, maybe I'll only get $1.50 back out again. So I think, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because not every channel, not every marketing channel, not every transactional channel is going to perform exactly the same. But as long as it's profitable, as long as it has some growth potential, as long as maybe you're tapping into new markets that you wouldn't be able to get to otherwise, maybe the margins aren't going to be as great in one acquisition channel versus another. But as long as I guess we're at a sustainable level across everything we're doing collectively, then it's probably worthwhile. But how do you start looking at both channel attribution, but also that more holistic attribution and profitability model?
Yeah, really depends on the brand, the size, where things go. We're a triple L partner, we're a partner, we use them both. They're both expensive tools, right, that can deliver an ROI, but I think like too many brands are rushing to use them, especially in the smaller emerging brand side. If you're not doing enough revenue, it probably isn't going to make a difference. The levers are probably more just looking at your total Shopify and Amazon sales to get your total spend and what's your MER, what's your efficiency rate there, and then just watching the actual like in platform attribution on 7-day click on Meta, for example, and just seeing what's actually happening on a 7-day click basis. There's always going to be people that are missed and untracked. There's always going to be some level of mistracking. So having those tools is certainly helpful if you can fit that in. We've also had some very large brands that have looked at it on triple whale, and as it scales with your pricing model, they just don't feel the cost per month might drive that level of efficiencies, and they're happy to look at things a little bit differently or try to make some decisions a little bit differently. So every business has different opportunities to look at different places, right? So I think it's looking at a few different models if you can as well, whether it's looking at GA last click, watching 7-day click in Meta, watching your blended results in Shopify, new versus blended, like new customer ROAS or CAC, and then your blended or returning customer ROAS and CAC, and trying to parse that out to know, hey, we have good exclusions on Meta. We're only focused on new customer. That's all we're doing to acquire new customers is Meta and Google. What does our new customer CAC look like in Shopify against those total new customer sales against total advertising spend there? And what is our efficiencies? And then just try to clip out what seems to be underperforming in Meta and Google without having the exact tie back to every last data point or metric there, and try to make some broader assumptions based on a couple of different data points to do your best you can to kind of piece everything together. Attribution's never going to be a perfect science. I think it's just about trying to get as much data as you can and make the best decisions as possible. And those attribution tools are just grossly expensive. What is your total investment? Not even your total business sales. So a lot of these tools now are scaling with what your revenue is. So I think for certain brands, how much are you spending and how much is going to factor into that, right? So I think if you are a high spender and you have a high Shopify ticket, then it probably makes sense. But if you're like a medium spender, a low spender, even with high Shopify sales, it might not be worth the return. So I think it's definitely a balance of how much is coming organically or from PR or from other channels and what really needs to be tracked. But I think when you're spending quite high digitally for purchase intent, getting a tracking tool that's a little bit more robust will help you make better decisions on a campaign or per ad basis, depending on what your spend levels are and what the costs are going to be. I can't say it's a single one size fits all decision that like, yes, we tell every brand they have to hop on Triple Whale. We don't. I think it's always case by case of what is North Team better for you? Is Triple Whale better for you? What are your resources? What do you need? What are your spends? It's case by case of where someone's going and what their expectations are, what their needs are. Yeah, attribution's a mess simply, but it's never going to be perfect science. You have to accept that. And I think looking at multiple touch points, even if you have Triple Whale, but looking at what's happening in platform, what's happening in Google, what's happening on blended, what's happening in Triple Whale or North Beam, and then making your decisions according to that is certainly helpful, and not just using one metric to decide all.
And how do you feel about there's been lots of talk about GA4, death of cookies, etc., making attribution even more murky, even making it harder. GA4, to me, on my website, I don't even have GA4 installed because I think it's so crappy and I think it's so useless in terms of I get more value personally on my website. And it's an e-commerce website, but it's a services website. So I sell my services on a subscription, but it's not like your traditional product-based e-com website that's got 1,000 products. But what I have found to be more useful for me and my business and my website is Clarity, Microsoft Clarity. I've actually found watching those sessions, watching how people navigate the site, watching where they linger, watching where they get stuck, watching the page before that they go to the contact page to find out more information. Just watching those sessions has been far more educational to me, or watching the long sessions versus the short sessions and what's different between them, and watching the top pages that are traversed and what they do when they're on them. It feels to me like that type of research, that type of more, I don't want to say purely qualitative because it is quantitative as well, because you can segment those sessions in Clarity for certain activities that somebody's done on the website. So there is a quantitative element to it, but it feels spending more time looking at that for many brands would be more valuable than trying to figure out GA4 and its nuances and its subtleties and all the report mechanisms that are in there. And would you recommend an alternate clickstream analytics platform other than GA4 that kind of goes back to the old UA model of just really simple, really clear reports that are super actionable versus something like GA4, which it feels like you need a PhD in data science to drive GA4 these days?
Yeah, I think that's the general sentiment from most people that we talk to. A lot of people are just using Shopify Analytics at this point and some of those pieces. But yeah, we are advising a lot of brands to get on Clarity. Hotjar was a piece with Clarity being essentially free. It's silly not to get that installed. There is some labor and some work to watch those sessions, and especially if you're a high volume store, like how do you approach that? How do you conquer that? It becomes a little bit more tricky. But yeah, I definitely am aligned with that. It's definitely certainly some another point of visibility. And I think the general sentiment is other analytics are more helpful, and a lot of people are shifting away from GA outside of watching the source medium report for some last click data. A lot of people are not as keen on what's happening there, especially with some of the stuff can just be shown to you a lot faster on Shopify. And now you can like request reports on Shopify through AI, and they can just spit you out a report without you even having to query it out. So it's so fast and so quick, and it's just more user friendly. And I think there's so many different things that you need to learn as an e-commerce marketer. And I think trying to get really familiar on how to build out all these reports and things of that nature just become cumbersome and difficult for some people to learn and do. And what's the value back? So I do think Shopify even has been a really great resource for a lot of brands to get and extract some of those quick data points that they need instead of needing Google Analytics to do.
Love it. And as we come down to the end of our time together, we've been spending almost an hour together. It's absolutely flown by. What is your take on GEO, agentic commerce, the move towards, it feels like it's moving pretty fast. ChatGPT's done a deal with Shopify where they're helping to develop their commerce APIs and et cetera. So it feels like we're pretty fast, at least in the retail space, maybe not so much in the B2B world, which is where I heavily play now. But it feels like we're pretty fast moving to a world where instead of search and find, it's search and answer, right? And query and answer. And I've redirected all my I've got a Brave plugin that redirects all my queries now to ChatGPT. I haven't used Google search. I can't remember the last time I used Google for search. I know I'm not everybody. I'm an early adopter of tech. I realize that's a small percentage. I think it's I read a stat the other day. I think it's only 0.15% of total web searches are going through ChatGPT today. So it's still a really tiny percentage of overall, but it's also growing very fast off of a very small base. So give it another 12 months, give it another 18 months, give it another 24 months with Grok and a lot of other free tools out there. Let's see where this lands. But I know for me personally that a tremendous amount of my traffic according to Clarity, is coming from ChatGPT today. And luckily I rank very well. I've done a lot of research on ChatGPT around my vertical and the space that I operate in, and I'm getting recommended. And even it's funny because somebody that I had on my podcast recently, they had done a search for podcasts that they should be on or ways in which they can grow their business. And ChatGPT recommended that they come on my podcast as a guest. So it's interesting that this shift is starting to happen. And I feel because I've been creating content with my name attached to it for over a decade now, and I'm on every corner of the internet from YouTube to Rumble to all the audio podcast channels to LinkedIn to Reddit to Twitter to everything. I feel like the GEO is rewarded for not only breadth and depth, but also duration. Like, how far back are you being reflected on the internet? How long has your brand, whether it's personal, professional, how long has that brand been in market? How long have they been building credibility in market from timestamps and date stamps and all these other things? It feels like these LLMs reward. uh, It's almost like it gives you definitely a credibility halo the longer you've been at something and the longer you've been associated with a specific topic or vertical or category. And so it feels like they're heavily weighting authority based on, okay, who's the flash in the pan, who's new to the game versus who's been doing this a long time and has a more credibility. So it feels like brands now more than ever before, they have to really think about how can we start building brand as soon as possible, but how can we do something that is going to stand the test of time so that we're perceived as being everywhere all the time? How can we make sure that we're putting out content on X, on Reddit, on all these different channels, right? Even if those channels don't necessarily lead to sales today, if they build credibility in your brand, in these LLMs, then the long-term benefits of that could be massive, right? So it's about how can we convince brands to make medium to long-term investments that won't show a 7-day click attribution. That feels like a really hard discussion to have with brands.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing with all this is it's just still so early. It's still so beginning. I think a lot of people are like theorizing this is so much further along than it is, and all of our jobs are going to be snatched, and marketing's going to be completely automated, and we're still a long way away from that. I think trying to build some tools and that there are some things that it can do very well, and I do think it can help move faster or cut headcount already, but it's not. It's still going to be a few years away from these things becoming streamlined and usable. There still has to be a practitioner to use and administer these tools. So I think there's a long way to go, but I think the sooner you can be an early adopter, the better off you are. If you're already doing everything else well, why not add this on, right? And try to find ways to build for this, for yourself and those search models you're talking about, things of that nature. So simply put, yeah, nothing works, everything works. You just got to be everywhere and doing everything right to find that level of success. So yeah, I think the sooner you can try to start figuring things out and get the adoption, if you have the resources to, I'd say I'm aligned to go for it, figure it out, try to learn it, be an early adopter. And sometimes you can get early to market, you can help build that share ahead of things. It's harder to play catch up later, right? So it's people probably were saying invested in TikTok when day one happened, right? So it's the same opportunity where it's going to be ignored. Too many people are going to ignore it. And then they're like, wow, I wish we did this 5 years ago. So the sooner you can adopt into something, the better off you are, even if the impact doesn't happen now. It's so much things are just for the long haul and you have to be everywhere and doing everything, even if you feel like nothing's working. It's all going to work and it's all going to help.
Love it. This has been a really super interesting conversation. I'll drop a link to your LinkedIn and your website in the show notes. Other than that, if anybody wants to reach out and have a conversation with you about growth marketing, full funnel marketing, look at customer lifecycle management, those sorts of topics that we've been discussing today, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Yeah, you feel free to reach out to me. I'm Zac Fromson on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out, connect with me there, and DMs are always open conversation. So probably the best way to get a hold of me.
Amazing. Now, as we do come down to the end of our time together, this is where I get to flip the script. I get to turn the microphone over to you, let you ask me one question, any question you like. It can be personal or professional. Mr. Zac Fromson, what is your question for me today?
Yeah, for hopping on. I didn't realize you've been doing these many podcasts for so long. What's kept you going to do? It sounds like you've done over 500 at this point. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, over 535 episodes. We release 3 new episodes a week. I've been doing this podcasting thing since 2016. Started out slow, started out doing solo podcasting, then started getting guests on because I found having guests on became a lot more sustainable over time than just doing solo podcast. And then we originally only did tech episodes, which was our Friday episode today, where we were only interviewing like tech founders, tech leaders in the e-commerce, omni-channel, digital retail space. Then we added our Monday mentorship episodes, which is what your episode will be. You're a guest mentor from one of my Monday mentorship episodes. Then we added latterly, because the interest and demand was there, we added a Wednesday episode, which is totally focused on B2B e-commerce, which is an area that I play heavily in today. And look, we may end up adding an AI episode. We'll just see. But I spend about 8 to 10 hours a week on content already. Adding to that is always a challenge. And I try to put out as much content as I can on LinkedIn and Reddit and X and everywhere else. I try to be as many places as I can, but it's hard as a solo creator, as also trying to run an entrepreneurial business where I'm providing services to clients. So it's always that balance, right? And luckily, I've met a huge amount of friends through the podcast. And so for me, that's been the driving force, is trying to give back to the community, trying to build credibility, trying to be able to open an opportunity to have conversations with incredibly smart people like yourself, where I'm not an expert on the topics that they're teaching me and by extension teaching my audience about. And yeah, there's been so many benefits, but I have to give credit where credit is due. It started with Gary Vee. I've been following Gary Vee for many years, and I just got sick of him yelling in my ear, if you think you're a thought leader, why don't you put your thoughts out in the world and let them be critiqued by the market? You can't be a thought leader unless you're putting your thoughts out into the world and sharing them with the wider world. So that was the push I needed. I think I had been listening to Gary Vee for probably at least 2 years before I ever started creating content at all. And certainly many years before I started my podcast. And I started my podcast before I ever had my own business too. So it wasn't like I started my podcast to drive business. It was more, how can I open up opportunities to have conversations with people that it would be difficult to have conversations with them any other way. And I still love it. I love having these conversations. I love learning from my guests. I love interacting with my guests. I love people. I'm an extreme extrovert. So many good things have come out of having a podcast, from opening up opportunities to speak at conferences and travel to events. And that was one of the things that Gary Vee said right at the beginning was, you may not know what good things are going to come out of creating content, but trust me, you have to trust the process. Good things will come. You just may not be able to predict what those good things are going to be until you actually do it. And you do it for a long enough period of time to see the fruits of your labor come to fruition. Yeah, it's been an amazing journey, and I still love doing it every single day.
It's awesome.
Listen, thank you so much for your conversation and your time today. Can't wait to speak to you again soon. If you'd like to get mentored by Jason for free, head over to greenwoodconsulting.net, scroll to the bottom of the page, and click Get Mentored by Jason.